And in the spirit of the title of the paper, Data Privacy Laws in Firm Production, Evidence from GDPR, I'll just echo what Jacques said, which is this is being recorded, so don't say anything you don't want heard until the end of discussion comments. Okay, please, take it away.
Thank you, Joel, and thank you for inviting me to present this paper. This is joint work with my co-authors, Diego Hernandez, Dean Lee, and Stepang. And in this paper, we take a production approach to understand the impact of GDPR on firms. So as you all know, data plays an important role for firm production. Firms use data for many purposes in their production process. In response to increasing the role of data in firm production, many governments around the world have implemented privacy regulations that govern how firms collect, store, and analyze data. And one of the prominent privacy regulations we have seen in the last decade is EU's General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR. GDPR is a very comprehensive and consequential privacy law. It affected more than 20 million firms across many countries, targeting EU residents, and there is no size threshold. However small you are, if you are serving goods or services to EU citizens, you are subject to GDPR. And many governments around the world took GDPR as a model, so it is a really important implications for privacy regulations around the world. Under GDPR, firms need to take costly measures to comply with GDPR. Some of these are, for example, firms need to make sure that their data is stored securely. They have to handle their customer delete requests. They have to keep detailed records of their data. And there is also large penalties in case of data breaches. And the existing survey evidence suggests that these measures are costly for firms. The numbers are around 1 to 2 million euros for small and medium enterprises and up to 70 million for large organizations. In this paper, we are going to take a production approach to study the impact of GDPR. So we'll think GDPR as an increased cost of managing data. So GDPR is a regulation that increases the cost of data for firms. And as most regulations that increase the cost of an input, that's going to distort firms' input choices. So we are going to model a GDPR as a wedge between the marginal product of data and its price. And this wedge is going to impact firms' data and computation choices. And then we are going to understand how this wedge affects these choices. And we think this production approach is valuable to understand the impact of GDPR because there is now a large literature on GDPR, but this literature typically focuses on firm outcomes, and in particular, most digital outcomes. And there is very little evidence on how GDPR affects firms' margins of adjustment. And this requires a framework to analyze how firms use and process data. With this background, we have two research questions in this paper. First, we are going to develop a production function framework and ask, how do firms combine data and computation and production? And then using this framework, we are going to quantify the cost of GDPR for firms and understand how they adjust their data and computation inputs in response to GDPR. How do we do this? We use data from one of the largest cloud computing providers. In this data set, we observe at the month level how much data firms store and how much computation they do for more than 100,000 firms worldwide. And this data covers many industries, not only digital economy, but we have industries like manufacturing, retail, and finance. Using this data, first we'll do an event study. We are going to compare data and computation decisions of domestic EU firms related to domestic US firms. And it makes sense to look at data because it is directly targeted by regulation. But to the extent that data and computations are substitutable in their production function, GDPR will also affect computation. Then we are going to develop a production function. We are going to assume that firms combine data and computation in an information production, and GDPR will be a wedge between data's cost and marginal product in this production framework. So what do we find? we find that GDPR significantly affects firms' data compute input mix. EU firms store 26% less data and do 15% less computation. So they become less data intensive. Their data goes down more than the computation. Our production function framework suggested data and computation are strong complements in production. So elastic substitution is around 0.3 and 0.4, and these are stronger complements than traditional inputs. Finally, we find that average Gdpr wage is equivalent to 20% tax that increases the cost of storing data. So firms behave as if data is 20% more costly after Gdpr, and this wage is larger for smaller firms. And one important caveat is that this paper is only about the cost of Gdpr for firms. So we don't do a full web analysis. We don't have anything to speak to benefits of Gdpr. In terms of the contribution, we contribute to now large literature on Gdpr. And the way our paper is different from this literature is that we study the key margin targeted by privacy laws, which is data, and we take a production approach to study Gdpr. We also contributed to this growing literature that considers data as an input in production function. To the best of our knowledge, ours is the first paper to incorporate and estimate both data and computation in firm production. We contributed a lot of literature on economics of privacy. And in terms of the way we model GDPR, we contributed literature on misallocation. This is the outline of my talk. First, I'm going to talk about GDPR and cloud computing. And then I'll show you our event study results. And then I'll move to my production framework, and then I'll conclude. Okay, so what is GDPR? GDPR is a privacy regulation that was passed in April 2016 and went into effect in May 2018. It replaced and harmonized the Data Protection Directive from 1995. Importantly, GDPR applies to firms located in EU or collecting data, personal data from EU residents, and it applies to both employee and customer data. So even if you are a B2B business to B2B business, you are still subject to GDPR because you naturally store some employee data. And supervised authorities in EU states enforce the regulation, and upon request, firms must be able to demonstrate their compliance. And the existing evidence suggests that there's large heterogeneity in the cost of timing of compliance. Survey evidence suggests that only 10% of firms were compliant at the time of the implementation. But one thing I would like to emphasize is that GDPR is a data protection law. It is different than the consumer protection approach, for example, US takes. Under data protection approach, a privacy regulation imposes a set of company obligations to protect data in addition to individual rights. So what are these obligations? For example, firms need to make operational changes, develop privacy notices, and do employee training. They need to hire a data protection officer. They need to handle customer and delete transfer requests. They have to keep records of processing activities. They have to make sure that their data is secure. And there's also increased liability with penalties up to 4% of global revenue. So these are important responsibilities of firms under GDPR, and these are also costly. But the question is that what kind of costs are these? So there is no official statistics on this, but what we did is we went through the survey evidence and analytical evidence, and we classified these as fixed and variable costs. And some of these costs are fixed and some of these costs are variable. So for example, data protection officer can be mostly considered as a fixed cost because you typically hire one of them, but some firms hire multiple, so it is partly also a variable cost. Handling customer delete and transfer requests can mostly be considered as a variable cost because most firms handle these requests manually. And finally, liabilities and insurance premium of the insurance typically increase with the data size. So we can think of liabilities as a very variable cost. And another point I would like to make about GDPR is that GDPR is a regulation that not only affects like the large firms. So to see this, you see the distribution of publicly reported GDPR fines. On the right, we have the fines that we see in headlines, Amazon, Meta, and so on. But if you look at the most of the fines, you see that these firms are pretty small. So there's a restaurant, there's a jewelry manufacturer. So the point I'm trying to make here is that all firms, however small they are need to comply with GDPR, and these regulation affects those firms as well. It is not only a regulation for large tech companies. Now let me talk about cloud computing, which is where our data comes from. So cloud providers offer on-demand access to scalable IT resources through the internet. In cloud computing, firms can request storage or computing or other IT services on demand. Cloud computing is a very widely adopted technology. Over 90% of large organizations use cloud computing. And this is an amazing data source to study a question like this, because you can see the computation and data storage decisions of a large number of firms in high frequencies. You can understand these firms' responses to regulation. And some examples of how firms use the data, use the cloud. For example, like Netflix use data storage to store their video files, and use compute to process customer requests. And Carrefour, a large grocery chain, use data storage and computing in cloud widely. Let me tell you more about our data. So first, we have detailed cloud usage from one of the largest cloud providers. This data covers from 2016 to 2021. And in this data, we observe how much data firms store in gigabytes and how much computation they do in terms of number of core hours. So for example, if you run a job for 4 hours with like 8 cores, it will be recorded as 4 times 8, 32 core hours. Our result of observation is firms, service, location, and month. So for example, this is a hypothetical example. What we see in the data is like MIT doing computation in East Coast server in May 2018. We also observe list and paid prices that firms pay for these services. So we think this data is great, but of course it has some limitations. We don't actually observe how firms use data stored in the cloud, so we don't observe what code they run. And this data obviously may not capture all data and computation. So for example, if you use both your on-prem servers and the cloud, or if you use multiple cloud providers, we won't be able to observe all of your data. However, we do many robustness checks that I will show you later to get around these problems, and we think these limitations do not significantly affect the results of the paper. On top of this cloud data, we also use data from Aberdeen or Hartangs, or now it's called Aberdeen. It's an establishment level technology adaptation. In this data, we observe 2 million US and 2.5 million US and 2 million EU establishments. And this data provides information on the extensive margin of cloud adoption and multi-homing. So through this data, we observe whether you use like multiple cloud providers and when you adapted cloud. And finally, we use other data sources to get information on industry classification and employment. So we have employment information available only for EU firms, for a subset of firms. Here are some summary statistics. As you can see, our data covers many industries. We not only have like services and software, we have firms from manufacturing, retail, trade, transportation, and so on. When you look at these firms, there is actually a pretty balance between EU and the US. Around half of the firms in each industry is in the EU. And when you look at their computation and storage, their relative use of data relative to computation is pretty similar across industries. Okay, so now let me move to our event study. So what we are going to do is we are going to do an event study to understand how GDPR affected firms' data and computation decision. And there is a well-known challenge if you want to study GDPR through an event study. There is a lack of natural control group due to regulation spillovers. Not only EU firms are subject to GDPR, US firms serving EU citizens are also subject to GDPR. Moreover, there are global spillovers that can affect firms that are not located in the EU. So what we do to address these challenges, we try to identify domestic EU firms and domestic US firms as much as possible. And to do that, we use the data centers that firms use in addition to country of origin. So we not only observe where these firms are, we also observe which data centers they use. And we think it is plausible that if EU firms only use data centers in the EU, it is likely that that firm is a domestic EU firm, and it is subject to GDPR. And if US firms only store data in US data centers, it is likely that there's a domestic US firms that is not subject to GDPR. Of course, this eliminates multinational firms, which are actually large and important, but we think it is important to identify these fully treated and controlled firms in order to estimate the effect of GDPR. So using these firms, we are going to construct a sample of firms who continuously use the cloud 12 to 13 months before the GDPR. And with these groups, we are going to run a difference and difference specification with flexible plans by industry and pre-GDPR cloud usage decides. Okay, so this is the main result of our paper. Here, what you see is how much data EU firms store relative to comparable US firms. And as you can see, before the GDPR, these EU and US firms are on a similar trend. And after GDPR, we see a large decline in the data stored by EU firms. We see that after 2 years, EU firms store almost 35% less data than comparable US firms. Maybe this is not surprising because GDPR targets data, and obviously firms are going to reduce their data. But when you look at computation, we see also a large decline here. EU firms do 20% less computation relative to domestic US firms 2 years after GDPR. So we see decline in data is larger than decline in computation. So EU firms become less data intensive after GDPR. I would like to make a few other comments on this result before I move on. So first of all, we see limited evidence of anticipation. And this is actually consistent with anecdotal evidence. Even though GDPR was announced like 2 years before it got implemented, it took so long for firms to comply with GDPR. And we know at the time of implementation, many firms weren't compliant with GDPR. Second, we see gradual decrease in data and computation after GDPR. Again, this can be explained by firms gradually comply with GDPR, and which can generate this gradual effect. And finally, one concern with this result might be that firms are just deleting data that they haven't been used for a long time. So some data is just sitting in their servers, and they just like delete that data, but there's actually no effect on these firms. We don't think this is the case because we see decline in computation as well. So firms delete data that actually process before the GDPR. So we think this data is not just like the useless data sitting in firms' servers. We also do this analysis by industry, and we see that the decline in computation, the larger decline in storage and smaller decline in computation is present across all industries. And one interesting thing we see is that the largest effect is on manufacturing. So our interpretation of this is that manufacturing firms are having a hard time complying with GDPR, so they actually reduce their data and computation a lot more than more sophisticated software firms. Okay, so let me give you a summary so far. We show decline in storage and data of EU firms related to US firms. And we have many additional analyses in the paper that I'm not going to present today. We do a bunch of robustness checks. For example, we show that results are not driven by differences in prices between the US and the EU. So it's not that prices in cloud computing increase a lot in the EU that explains decline in data and storage. We show that substitution to other cloud providers or in-house IT unlikely to explain the results. And we also find larger effects with respect to countries' enforcement strictness, but the results are a bit noisy. So the key takeaway from this part of the presentation is that GDPR significantly changed firms' data and computation input choices. This is a suggestive evidence that after GDPR, this regulation introduces a wedge between the marginal product of storing data and its price. And it doesn't really tell us what is the cost of GDPR. So to quantify this, we are going to next develop a production function framework and model firms' input decision. Okay, so let me talk about this production function framework. So we assume that firms produce information using data and computation in a CS production function. So this makes sense because data itself is useless, computation itself is useless, but firms combine these three inputs, produce information. And in this production function, there's a few important parameters. The first one is unobserved compute productivity. This is firm specific, and this quantifies how good you are at computing. So some firms might be a lot better at computing the same piece of data than others, and this introduces unobserved firm level heterogeneity in computing sophistication. The other one is illustrative substitution. This parameter governs the substitution between data and computation. One important point I would like to make about this production function is you don't see any output capital labor in this production function. We actually don't model the full production function because it's not clear how to incorporate data, information, computation in a production function framework. And most likely the use of information and data are very heterogeneous across firms. So that's why we only develop a partial production function framework where we only model how firms combine data and computation to produce information. So with this assumption, we are going to make a cost minimization assumption. So we assume that firms choose data storage and computation in the cloud to minimize their information production cost every period. And this makes a lot of sense for cloud computing because data and computation can be adjusted flexibly in the cloud. You can adjust your data storage and computation as much as you want to very easily. And typically, prices are linear and fixed in cloud computing. So we think this cost minimization assumption is a reasonable assumption in the context of cloud computing. So if you make this standard cost minimization assumption, and if you write down firms' first order conditions, this is what you get. So let me walk you through this step by step. So first of all, we introduce a wedge term, which we denote by lambda, and we say that pre-GDPR, the cost of data is what you pay the cloud provider. So there is no additional wedge, there is no additional friction. And post-GDPR, there is this additional wedge generated by the regulation. So the cost of data is not what you pay the cloud provider, but you also pay the regulatory cost. So the post-GDPR data cost is this 1 plus lambda times the cost of cloud. So this lambda essentially quantifies the cost of GDPR. So under this assumption and under cost minimization, if you just take the first order conditions of firms' optimal compute and data decisions, this is what you get. This is a very simple, very basic production function theory. Firms' compute to data ratio is affected by a few parameters. It's affected by the ratio of prices, and this relationship is governed by elasticity of substitution. The compute to data ratio post GDPR is affected by the GDPR cost shock. So the larger the lambda is, the more you substitute the computation relative to data. And finally, this ratio depends on firms' compute augmenting technology. So the higher omega C you have, the higher compute to data you will have in production because you are better at computation. So it is essentially with this first order conditions, we can find the parameters that govern firms' compute to data ratio in production. And finally, we split this compute augmenting productivity into 3 parts: firm-specific part, industry-specific part, and idiosyncratic shock. So what we do in this paper is we estimate this equation. We essentially observe compute and data at the month level. We observe prices at the month level. And we estimate this equation to identify the wedge generated by the GDPR. And there's a bunch of details I'm not going to talk about, but of course, one important concern is endogeneity of prices. What we do is that we use a shift share design to get around this endogeneity. Okay, so let me show you the results of this production function framework. So we start with elasticity of substitution. We find that compute and data are strong complements. We see that elasticity of substitution across industries are around like 0.3 and 0.4, which suggests that data and compute are stronger complements than traditional inputs. So for example, capital and labor typically assume to have elasticity of substitution around 0.7, 0.8. So we see that these two inputs are strong complements. And we see that the production technology is not that different across industries. There is some heterogeneity, but not that much. And the second thing we observe is that elasticity of substitution goes down after GDPR, but that effect is also small. So we can interpret this result as GDPR affecting firms' information production technology, but not that much. So now let me show you the result on the production cost of GDPR. So we estimated these firm-specific wedges. So we are going to use those wedges to understand what will be the increase in production costs due to GDPR. Okay, so let's start with the changes in the cost of data storage. So here, what I show you is the average wedge by industry. This wedge is the increase in the cost of data for firms. And we see that on average, GDPR is equivalent to 20% tax on price of storing data. And we see some heterogeneity across industries, though this is not significant. Software industries face 24% average wedge, and manufacturing firms face only 17% wedge. An important question is what explains this cost heterogeneity. We do a couple of analyses in the paper, and I think the most interesting one is the relationship between wages and the firm size. We see that wages monotonically decreasing with firm size. We see smallest firms face the largest wages, and largest firms face the smallest wages. And this is consistent with like the large evidence in the GDPR literature, which say that smaller firms are more likely to be affected by GDPR than larger firms. Okay, so I showed you the change in the cost of data, but this has not necessarily been per se. What we care is how this increase in the cost of data affects firms' cost of information or the cost of overall production. So now I'm going to show you the effect of this wedge on the information production cost and the overall production cost. So to do that, what we could do is, we know the production function for information. So you can take the dual of production function and you can write the cost function of information. And when you write the cost function of information, this is what you get. And the wedge shows up here. So the wedge affects the cost of information through this cost function formula, and it depends on prices, complete productivity, and elasticity of substitution. So that's why this production function formula is useful, because we can translate the increase in the cost of data to increase in the cost of information. And what we do is we calculate the cost of information with or without Gdpr. And in the counterfactual without Gdpr, we set we set lambda to 0. So this is the average increase in the cost of information by industry. We see that cost of information increases only by 3.7% on average, with some heterogeneity. And there's an important question here. How can we reconcile 20% increase in the cost of data with only 20% increase in the cost of data with only 3.7% increase in the cost of information? The main reason is that the data has smaller expenditure shares in information production than computation. If you are familiar with like cloud prices, computation is a lot more expensive than the data. And actually firms on average spend 80% of their information cost on computation, and only 20% of information cost on data. So this low share of expenditure share of data makes this 20% increase in the cost of data only 3.7% increase in the cost of information. So in other words, Gdpr targets the cheaper input in the information production cost, which reduces the overall effect of Gdpr. Okay, so finally, we are going to do some back-of-the-envelope calculations to look at the overall cost of overall increase in the cost of firm production. To do that, we are going to need a bunch of assumptions because we don't have the full production function. We cannot calculate the cost of production. But what we could do is we can make some additional assumptions. So for example, if you assume the production function is CS between information and non-information inputs, and if you make some assumptions on the production function itself, you can actually develop a formula that will tell you how the increase in the cost of information will affect the increase in the overall production cost. And what we find here is that the implied cost of Gdpr is heterogeneous across firms, across industries, but we find that software firms spend 3 billion euros like every year. Services industries spend close to 12 billion euros every year to comply with Gdpr. And importantly, these are variable costs, so firms spend these costs every year. Another point I would like to make is this is only variable cost. So we focus on the variable cost of Gdpr here because variable cost affects firms' input decisions, not the fixed cost. So these numbers don't take into account the fixed cost firms might be paying. Okay, so with this, let me conclude. In this paper, we took a production approach to study the effects of Gdpr on data and computation. We first estimated an event study, and we find that EU firms reduce their data by 26% and compute by 15% relative to comparable US firms. Then we estimated the production function to quantify the cost of Gdpr. We find that data and computation are strong complements in production function, and Gdpr is equivalent to a wedge, a 20% tax on data storage. but this 20% increase in the cost of data leads to only 1% increase in the total production cost, because data information, the expenditure share of data tend to be lower in information production function. Thank you.